August 19th, 1942. Japanese soldiers landed on Guadalcanal, supremely confident. They believed Americans were soft from lives of luxury. They were about to encounter something that would shatter every belief they held about war. But how could a single island change everything so drastically? Imagine Lieutenant Yunjiro Imi scribbling in his diary near Tivu Point as he and Colonel Ichiki's detachment waded ashore. For these veterans of China and Southeast Asia, victory was an expectation, not a hope. They had been told the Americans were poorly trained, easily frightened, incapable of matching the Japanese fighting spirit. Colonel Ichiki himself, a celebrated tactician, brushed aside caution. "These are Americans," he reportedly declared. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." This wasn't merely bravado. It was a deeply held conviction rooted in years of swift, brutal conquests. But Guadalcanal was different. It was a crucible where two fundamentally opposing philosophies of warfare were about to collide. The Japanese reliance on audacious spirit and close-quarters combat versus the American emphasis on overwhelming firepower, meticulous planning, and a logistical machine unlike any the world had ever seen. Could sheer courage truly overcome a systemic torrent of lead, steel, and endless supplies? The stage for this unprecedented clash was set weeks earlier, on August 7th. Operation Watchtower saw 11,000 U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division storming ashore at Lunga Point. Their objective was clear: seize a nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a perimeter, and hold it. This wasn't just an airfield. It was Henderson Field, named for a hero of Midway, and it would become the strategic heart of the entire campaign. Control of Henderson Field meant control of the vital air and sea lanes during daylight hours, a fact that would dictate everything. The Japanese response to the American landing was swift and devastating, at least initially. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Mikawa executed a brilliant surprise attack at the Battle of Savo Island, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers. It was the worst defeat in U.S. Navy history, and it sent the remaining Allied naval forces scurrying, taking with them much-needed supplies. Suddenly, the Marines on Guadalcanal were stranded, isolated, with dwindling provisions and no immediate naval support. This crushing blow, however, didn't make Henderson Field less important. It made it more so. Without naval supremacy, control of the skies became paramount. And for that, Henderson Field was essential. It transformed into a desperate, existential prize. Can you imagine the terror, the isolation, yet the fierce determination that must have gripped those Marines? And conversely, the Japanese, still convinced of their inevitable victory, utterly unaware of the systemic might they were truly up against. What kind of unimaginable horror would unfold to reveal the true cost of their profound misjudgment? The stage was set for a brutal clash, but the first act would unfold in a way no one, especially the Japanese, ever expected. It began with an officer named Colonel Ichiki, whose overconfidence would lead to an unprecedented disaster. This first-rate tactician, brimming with contempt for American soldiers, dismissed all warnings. His plan? A head-on, nighttime assault across a narrow sandbar, relying solely on Japanese fighting spirit. What happened next wasn't just a defeat. It was a slaughter that forever redefined infantry combat. Flushed with the initial success of their covert landing, Colonel Ichiki, commanding 9 M17 elite Japanese soldiers, cast aside caution. His orders were explicit: await the rest of his regiment. But Ichiki, a veteran steeped in the dogma of Japanese invincibility, harbored a profound disdain for American fighting prowess. He had studied their reports, concluding they were soft, undisciplined, and would break under pressure, a conviction he'd famously declared would see them swept into the sea before sunrise. This wasn't merely overconfidence. It was a lethal miscalculation. Unbeknownst to Ichiki, a Marine patrol under Captain Charles Brush had already clashed with his reconnaissance unit, killing 31 Japanese and capturing documents that revealed his presence and, crucially, his profound underestimation of American strength. General Vandegrift, commander of the Marines, immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. An attack was coming, and it would be from the east. He swiftly ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to fortify the defenses along a narrow sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines mistakenly called the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu. Here, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Creswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, meticulously prepared. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring no square foot of that sandbar would be left uncovered. As the sun dipped below the horizon on August 20th, Ichiki prepared his men. Japanese doctrine emphasized the supremacy of spiritual power and the devastating effectiveness of aggressive night attacks. He believed his bayonet-wielding veterans would shatter American lines in close combat. Just after midnight, a Solomon Island scout, Jacob Vuza, tortured and escaped from Japanese captors, stumbled into Marine lines, his desperate warning confirming the inevitable. Moments later, the night exploded. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, screaming battle cries, firing rifles and hurling grenades, surged across the sandbar. They ran directly into a killing zone, prepared with methodical precision. The Marines' M19-17A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected in World War I, could sustain 600 rounds per minute, indefinitely. Imagine charging into an invisible wall of lead and steel. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers were torn apart by the heavy .30 caliber rounds. Those few who made it across the sandbar were met by 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that turned men into shredded meat. The attack was not just repelled, it was systematically annihilated. This wasn't a tactical retreat or a stalemate. It was a slaughter. What would that do to your belief system? The Japanese kept coming, their courage undeniable, their spirit unbroken by the overwhelming fire. They reached Marine positions, engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat. But the prepared defenses held. The interlocking fields of fire were impenetrable. As dawn broke, Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. Over 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water, a grim testament to the overwhelming American firepower. With daylight, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar, systematically hunting down the few Japanese survivors hiding in the coconut groves. The Battle of the Tenaru was over by midday on August 21st. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who landed, approximately 800 were dead. Colonel Ichiki himself was among the fallen, either by ritual suicide or in a final, futile charge. Marine casualties totaled a mere 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese was devastating. Their myth of invincibility their belief in the supremacy of their warrior spirit shattered. They had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training would triumph. Instead, they encountered an integrated system of destruction. Coordinated machine guns that never jammed, artillery that rained down with impossible precision, and a level of material wealth that intelligence had utterly failed to comprehend. The Americans hadn't broken. They had waited, prepared, and systematically destroyed. Tenaru was a brutal awakening, a systematic demolition of Japanese tactical assumptions. Yet, for the Imperial Japanese High Command, it was merely a setback, not a re-evaluation. Still refusing to accept these new realities, they prepared an even larger, more desperate gamble on a remote ridge. With Ichiki's force annihilated, Japan brought thousands more troops to Guadalcanal. But there was a critical, fatal flaw. These new soldiers arrived with almost nothing but their rifles. They were ferried in by the Tokyo Express, a desperate nighttime destroyer run designed to minimize exposure to American air power. It was fast, efficient, but it couldn't carry heavy artillery, tanks, or even adequate food and ammunition. This logistical chokehold would become as lethal an enemy as any American Marine. General Kawaguchi, a man determined to succeed where Ichiki had failed, planned a sophisticated three-pronged attack on a key ridge dominating Henderson Field. What he didn't know was that a Marine legend named Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson was waiting, having prepared a trap even deadlier than the Tenaru River. Could sheer courage, fueled by a spirit over steel doctrine, overcome starving bellies and empty ammunition pouches? Or would Guadalcanal continue to expose the brutal realities of modern war? The echoes of Ichiki's suicidal charge had barely faded when the first elements of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade began arriving. Thousands of fresh Japanese troops, veterans hardened by campaigns in China, landed covertly at night, brought by swift destroyers. The infamous Tokyo Express was ingenious in its speed, allowing the Japanese to move men and some supplies without being decimated by the Cactus Air Force during daylight. Yet, this very ingenuity carried a catastrophic hidden cost. These destroyers were simply incapable of transporting the heavy artillery, tanks, and vast quantities of food and ammunition a modern offensive required. Soldiers arrived with just their rifles, their bayonets, and an iron will. They were expected to conquer an island, not with overwhelming firepower, but with sheer fighting spirit. Kawaguchi, a shrewd tactician, learned from Ichiki's mistakes. He wouldn't attempt a frontal assault. His plan was a complex, three-pronged thrust, with the main effort aimed at a long, narrow ridge that offered the best approach to Henderson Field from the south. This coral spine, just 1,000 meters long, covered in unforgiving kunai grass and scattered trees, was dissected by deep, jungle-choked ravines. It was perfect terrain for stealthy infiltration, for night attacks, for the kind of close-quarters combat the Japanese excelled at. But Kawaguchi's intelligence was incomplete. He didn't know that Marine intelligence, thanks to a daring raid by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's raiders, had already identified this ridge as the most likely axis of attack. Edson, a decorated veteran known for his calm under fire and meticulous planning, understood the jungle's brutal logic. He requested permission to fortify the ridge, and General Vandegrift gave the green light. From September 10th, Edson's elite raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, roughly 840 Marines in total, began transforming that ridge into an impenetrable fortress. Machine guns were in place to create interlocking fields of fire that would shred anything crossing their paths. Mortar crews registered their targets on every likely approach route. The artillerymen of the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions, ready to rain down high explosives within minutes of a call. Every contour of the terrain, every advantage of firepower, was calculated and prepared. The ridge was indeed ideal for infiltration, but Edson had ensured it would also be a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's offensive began. Unlike Ichiki's desperate charge, this was a more sophisticated, insidious attack. Japanese infantry slipped through the tangled ravines on both sides of the ridge, probing for weak points, then concentrating for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage, confused, and utterly terrifying. In the pitch darkness, the jungle erupted into a cacophony of screams, rifle fire, grenade explosions, and the chilling glint of bayonets in the brief flashes of muzzle fire. Marines found themselves in brutal hand-to-hand combat with soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. Imagine fighting in an invisible war, where the enemy could be anywhere, a whisper away. And your only defense was the disciplined, systematic application of firepower you'd spent months perfecting. But Edson's preparations held. When Japanese forces massed for a breakthrough, Marine mortars and the 11th Marines artillery delivered shattering barrages, often landing so close to friendly lines that shrapnel wounded American troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed cherry red, their continuous streams of lead tearing through the attacking waves. One man, Sergeant John Basilone, a towering figure from Edson's Raiders, became a legend that night. When his machine gun crew was killed or wounded, Basilone single-handedly kept his gun firing, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks, even braving enemy fire to carry desperately needed ammunition. His extreme endurance and courage would earn him the Medal of Honor. As dawn broke on September 13th, the first night's assault had failed. But Kawaguchi wasn't giving up. He still had thousands of troops. Edson, anticipating renewed attacks, consolidated his lines, pulling back to the center of the ridge. General Vandegrift rushed reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to some 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again. This time, the Marines were ready with even stronger positions, even more concentrated firepower. The second night was a maelstrom of even greater intensity. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate, suicidal attempts to break through. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in the face of unrelenting machine gun fire and artillery. Some attacks came within yards of Edson's command post, forcing the Marine commander himself to grab a rifle and join the firing line. But once again, American firepower and meticulous defensive preparations prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. The ridge, now scarred and littered with Japanese dead, would forever be known as Bloody Ridge, or Edson's Ridge. The cost was staggering. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Marine casualties, while significant, were sustainable. 104 killed, over 200 wounded. For the Japanese survivors, it was another profound, terrifying shock. They had expected to fight an infantry battle in the darkness, where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they had encountered an invisible wall of lead and steel, a coordinated system of destruction, artillery, machine guns, mortars, all concentrated with a precision they could not match. American commanders knew they were coming. They prepared killing zones, They waited. Then they unleashed hell. This battle, combined with Ichiki's prior disaster, etched a brutal truth into the Japanese psyche. Their spirit over steel doctrine was failing. Their tactical assumptions, honed in China, were proving suicidal against an industrial power. And as the campaign wore on, an even more insidious enemy began to claim Japanese lives: starvation and disease. The Tokyo Express, brilliant for moving men, was a disaster for sustaining them. Soldiers on Guadalcanal were dying not just from American bullets, but from hunger, malaria, dysentery, and untreated wounds. By late October, more than 60% of Japan's 17th Army on Guadalcanal was incapacitated by illness or malnutrition, with men dying at a rate of 50 a day, mostly from non-combat causes. Think about that. You're a hardened soldier. You've survived brutal combat, only to slowly starve to death or succumb to a disease that a simple pill could prevent. What does that do to your belief system, to your will to fight? American supply ships, protected by the now dominant Cactus Air Force, brought an endless stream of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Marines ate, even if the rations were bland. Their wounded received plasma and sulfa drugs. The stark contrast was brutal. Japanese soldiers were reduced to eating grass and bark, their bodies ravaged by disease, their ammunition so scarce it was rationed down to individual rounds. The jungle, once a potential ally for Japanese infiltration, became a merciless prison, trapping starving, dying men. Despite these two catastrophic failures, Ichiki's annihilation and Kawaguchi's bloody defeat on Edson's Ridge, the Japanese were not ready to give up. The stakes were too high, the loss of face too great. By October 1942, they were indeed throwing everything into one last, massive offensive, bringing all they had to bear, only to face a fully entrenched American system ready for total war that would finally break their will. This was their ultimate push to retake Henderson Field. But what happened next wasn't just another defeat. It was the final, brutal realization that their fate on Guadalcanal was sealed, not by a single battle, but by a relentless, overwhelming system they couldn't possibly match. Imagine fighting not just an enemy, but starvation, disease, and the crushing realization that no help is coming. Following the failures at Tenaru and Edson's Ridge, the Imperial High Command was unwilling to concede. Instead, they doubled down, aiming for a decisive blow. General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal to personally oversee the largest offensive of the campaign. He brought with him elements of the veteran 2nd Division, fresh from China, promising more men, better coordination, and critically, some desperately needed artillery finally delivered via destroyers. The stage was set for an unprecedented clash. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, a rare sight on Guadalcanal given the logistical nightmare of transporting them, led an assault across the Matanikau River. But the Americans, now a mixed force of battle-hardened Marines under the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller and newly arrived Army units from the 164th Infantry Regiment, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank unleashed a torrent of fire, knocking out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed, leaving a trail of heavy casualties and a stark warning of what was to come. The main assault, however, was reserved for the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu surged from the south, aiming to shatter the American lines below Henderson Field. This was to be the breaking point. Yet, they collided with the impregnable will of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced by the 164th Infantry. The fighting that night would become etched in Marine Corps legend. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers, screaming battle cries, crashed against the American perimeter. Breakthroughs were fleeting, immediately sealed by savage counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles, pistols, or anything to continue the fight. Artillery from the 11th Marines, directed with pinpoint precision, rained down danger-close missions, shells landing mere yards from friendly positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood by, ready to unleash its fearsome power if called upon. At one critical juncture, only a single Marine battalion held the line between the Japanese and Henderson Field, but they would not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had distinguished himself just weeks earlier at Bloody Ridge, once again became the indispensable hero. When ammunition ran perilously low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried heavy boxes through enemy fire, ensuring his guns kept firing. He repaired damaged weapons under fire, and when one position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu lay dead, killed by machine gun fire during the night. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had perished in the desperate attempt, while American casualties, though severe, were sustainable. But the turning point for Guadalcanal wasn't just on land. Simultaneously, the seas around the island erupted in a series of devastating engagements that would be known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12th through 15th. In a confused nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers bravely confronted a Japanese bombardment force, including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. In the Inferno, Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, the only two American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. But the Japanese battleship Hai was disabled and later sunk by aircraft. Crucially, Henderson Field remained operational. 2 nights later, the battleship Kirishima made another attempt at bombardment, only to be intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a chilling display of radar-directed gunnery, the Washington slammed 9 16-inch shells into the Kirishima, sinking her with heavy loss of life. But perhaps most decisively, American aircraft and surface ships utterly destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and even those were annihilated by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers were lost in that convoy alone. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For the Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply, but instead they learned of the naval disasters, the destroyed convoys, and the crushing realization that no more help was coming. Rations, already meager for starving men, were reduced even further. Medical supplies, critically short for months, became virtually non-existent. Captured diaries from this period painted a horrifying picture of a slow, agonizing collapse. Entries describing single rice balls per day, disease spreading unchecked, desperate men burning their dead, eating grass and bark, succumbing to poisonous plants. They were not just fighting Americans, they were fighting starvation, disease, and the profound, soul-crushing despair of utter abandonment. With their last major offensive shattered and their supply lines permanently severed, the Japanese High Command faced an unthinkable decision. But what would it mean for the thousands of starving, dying soldiers left behind? And what profound lessons did this 6-month crucible etch into the minds of both sides? By February 1943, the silence on Guadalcanal was deafening. The Japanese had evacuated. It wasn't just a retreat. It was an admission of catastrophic failure. But what enduring lessons did this 6-month crucible etch into the minds of those who fought, forever changing the course of the Pacific War and revealing the true nature of modern combat? What does it mean when courage and sacrifice are simply not enough? After months of relentless attrition, with supply lines severed and their last major offensive shattered, the Japanese High Command faced an unthinkable decision. They could not openly admit defeat, but privately, the reality was stark. Continuing the fight on Guadalcanal meant the complete annihilation of their 17th Army. So in late December 1942, they began planning Operation K, the clandestine evacuation of their remaining forces. From a peak strength of 36,000 personnel, only around 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, and of those perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to even walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or too ravaged by starvation to move. In a remarkable feat of naval stealth, Japanese destroyers, using the same Tokyo Express routes that had brought so many men to their doom, extracted 10,652 soldiers over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a tactical success, but it could not mask the profound strategic defeat. Guadalcanal was a massacre. Of the Japanese forces, an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 died. Roughly 4,800 in combat, and a staggering 10,000 to 15,000 from starvation and disease. American casualties were also severe but ultimately sustainable. Around 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and thousands more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But America's industrial might and manpower could readily replace these losses. Japan simply could not. The psychological impact on Japanese military thought was immense. A shock wave that reverberated through their command structure. For the first time in sustained ground combat, the Imperial Japanese Army had been decisively defeated. Their cherished belief in the warrior spirit, the idea that courage and ferocity could overcome any material disadvantage, was shattered on the ridges and rivers of Guadalcanal. Every offensive based on this doctrine had failed, resulting in catastrophic casualties. Japanese officers who survived and later reflected consistently pinpointed several devastating truths. A complete underestimation of American fighting qualities, a vast disparity in equipment and supplies, and fundamentally inadequate logistics against an enemy that controlled the sea and air. Spiritual power and tactical skill, they learned, were simply insufficient against systemic disadvantages in firepower and resources. What does it mean for an entire nation's military philosophy to be rendered obsolete in 6 brutal months? For the Americans, The lessons were different, but equally profound. Guadalcanal proved that American forces could match the Japanese in the brutal crucible of jungle warfare. The myth of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine, combined arms coordination, and superior logistics worked. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating the Japanese. Yet, they also gained a grudging respect for the Japanese soldiers' tenacity, their willingness to fight to the death, to endure unimaginable suffering rather than surrender. This campaign forged a new understanding of their formidable adversary. Guadalcanal was the ultimate collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages. The other side believed in the systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The humid, disease-ridden jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. And while it took 6 months of savage fighting, the outcome was undeniable. Concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, Guadalcanal was where reality destroyed illusion. They learned their training was based on false assumptions, their tactics designed for a different war, their logistics fatally inadequate. Many later described it as the moment they first understood Japan would lose the war. For the Americans, it was the moment they shattered an empire's myth and forged the template for victory across the Pacific. The terror on Guadalcanal, for the Japanese, wasn't just fear of American soldiers, formidable as they were. It was the terror born from the crushing realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. This was the new face of war, brutal, unforgiving, and utterly transformed.